Hello and welcome back to our ESL methods class. This presentation will focus on chapters 10 through 12 in Larsen-Freeman's text. Let's begin with chapter 10, content-based instruction. If you wish, there's a useful video below that you can click on your own time and you can see someone deliver a content-based instruction lesson, and that will kind of give you a background and a visual of what we're going to be talking about. So, to provide a quick overview of content-based instruction can be two things. It can be where it's teaching the content from other academic disciplines, and they're doing that within a language course, or it could be vice versa, where students are in a content-specific course, like a math class, a social studies class, a science class, but they're also meanwhile learning language skills and vocabulary in that class. One thing that Larsen-Freeman notes at the beginning of the chapter is that it's important to realize that regardless of what kind of scaffolds, supports, or content-based interventions you can provide to students, it's still best for students to develop literacy skills in their native language before they transition to a second language. And so the best scenario is when students develop those fundamental literacy skills so that they can quickly acquire the content in their native language and then gradually transfer to their second language. So content-based instruction in the United States can take two forms. If students are in ESL classes, they are receiving content-based instruction in the target language, which would be English. If students are in bilingual classes, they could be receiving content-based instruction in either their native language and the target language, which would be English. Either way, regardless of what form that the SIOP lessons take, it's very important that teachers create a clear language objective along with a clear content learning objective. And this is similar to the SIOP methods, which we will learn in greater detail later in our class. So to break down the different types of objectives, first we have the content objective. The content objective is what specific information, knowledge, skills, and abilities that students are expected to be able to produce after learning the lesson. And the content objectives are based on each content area. So you have math content objectives, English language arts, reading content objectives, social studies objectives, science objectives, and then various other types of classes like agricultural science or music classes also have their own objectives. In Texas, we would call the content objectives the TEKs or the TEKs, and I provided a link to Lead Forward, which gives a good resource of the different TEKs based on each different grade level. And they also have them in English and Spanish, if you're interested in being a bilingual teacher. So we just finished talking about the content objectives. Now let's transition into language objectives. So language objectives are the specific language forms, vocabulary, language structure, the tenses, the punctuation that students need to understand fully the content. So this is the required language skills that will give students access to their math classes and to their science content that they receive in their science classes. Because if students, especially English language learners, do not have that prerequisite vocabulary or they do not have those language skills, they will have a large difficulty understanding the teacher's instruction. So even though those English language learners probably could grasp the content and could learn the content, there's a language barrier. And so the whole idea of content-based instruction is that it takes away that language barrier so students have equal access to the content and they can gain content knowledge at the same time as they gain language knowledge. In Texas, our language objectives are called the ELPS, the English Language Proficiency Standards. They're not as clear cut as the TEKS. They're not laid out for each grade level and for each specific language level of a student. But there is some useful guides that I include below and some links. One of them, especially the page 21 of this ELPS resource supplemental document, is very useful because it provides like sentence stems or kind of a format that teachers can use to write their own language objectives. So I decided to include an example of both a content objective and a language objective to further exemplify the difference between the two. So if you look at 3.8D, this is a science content objective from 3rd grade. And so the objective for the content is that students will identify the planets in the Earth's solar system and their position in relation to the sun. So this is the specific academic knowledge that students are supposed to learn in this science class. It's science specific. It's specific to the content area. Now, while students are learning that, in order to fully have the ability to be able to understand the position in relation to the sun, students do need to understand some fundamental language concepts. So this goes into our language objective for that science TEK. This would be your ELPS or your language objective you could write. I mean, it's not the only one, but this was one I thought of. So the first one would be students will be able to use directional language, so closer, further, next to, at the end, to describe the relative position of two objects. As you can see, starting with this language objective, if students did not have that directional language, it would be very hard for them to compare the relative distance of certain planets from the sun. So this is kind of like fundamental pre-existing prior knowledge that if students do not already have, if they're English language learners, it needs to be taught to them so that they can fully engage in the lesson and fully understand the teacher's instruction. The second language objective I thought of was also that students would be able to use ordinal transitions, so transitional phrases, to indicate position. So it's kind of like when you're writing these kinds of transitions, you have first, second, third. So when you're writing a paragraph and you want to start the paragraph with like first, second, later, next, what have you. That's ordinal transitions. And so it's important that students understand those transitions because once again, they're having to describe the order that objects are being placed. And if they don't understand the terms of first, second, third, and fourth, they will not understand that science content of that lesson because they'll be confused about the order in which the planets go and how they compare in terms of the relationship to the sun. So with content-based instruction, some of the language use and learning activities are that teachers begin the lesson by referencing what students already know. They reference students' past concept knowledge. So they try to build on students' prior knowledge. So it's not introducing a totally new concept to those students. It's being able to connect to what they already know and making it more accessible and also more interesting to students because they can already relate to it and see the relevance of it because they've learned it before, so it must be important. Moreover, normally vocabulary and grammar are incorporated into the content knowledge learning. So, and when it says authentic context, that also means that students are learning the content and grade level appropriate vocabulary and grammar that will help them be able to follow along with what the teacher says, and also the students themselves to communicate their understanding and their knowledge in assessments that could be writing or reading assessments. Either way, students need that vocabulary and that grammar so that they can effectively also communicate what they know. Furthermore, there should be meaningful, demanding language content, and that language should be relevant to not only that content area, but it also should be relevant to the real world and what students' interests are. So students need to learn, most importantly, the language that they'll use frequently in the real world, in their careers, but also what they'll be using frequently in that content area. So it's kind of like high impact, high frequency words that are used in that content area should be stressed. Other features of content-based instruction are that students are actively involved. They're often working with partners or in small groups to facilitate collaboration with fellow students. That helps increase engagement and also provides scaffolds with peers who might have more of a content knowledge or also more of an academic vocabulary in English, who can help those English language learners and support them. Furthermore, in content-based instruction lessons, students are taught thinking skills for the academic tasks. And many times graphic organizers are used to teach students and illustrate visually the thinking skills students are using. So, for example, cause and effect has like an arrow to show directional thinking, like a cause first, then the effect, and how the effect is based on the cause. And so that directional thinking is indicated with an arrow, or there's other types of graphic organizers as well. Furthermore, content-based instruction follows a whole language approach. So a whole language approach is the idea that language is not broken down into individual parts at first. Instead, students are provided meaningful texts and they're asked to comprehend the entire text first. Later, after they understand the general meaning of that text, they might analyze each specific part of that text. So they might analyze the type of vocabulary that's used, or the type of grammar that's used, or the verb tense, or they might even practice with pronunciation, how to pronounce certain words in that text. But first, the most important part, according to whole language, is that students understand or have a general grasp of the text, like the main idea of the text. Another aspect of whole language approach is that because students need to have an understanding and comprehension of the text as a whole, it's very important that they read engaging literature that they find very interesting and that appeals to their interest levels. This way, once students get engaged in the topic and can understand the general sense of the text, later they can learn phonics, grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation through that individual text that they've already become interested in. In this way, students are not learning it in isolation, where you have 5 minutes of phonics time, and then you have 10 minutes of grammar time where you practice sentence structure. No, instead, the whole language approach would be where students are presented with a text. They practice reading it several times with the teacher's support. They end up developing a comprehension of the main ideas of that text. And then later, the teacher and the students both break down the text into its parts, like, do a phonics lesson on some of the frequent words that are appearing in the text, the frequent spelling patterns, or do a vocabulary lesson on some unknown or high academic words that students might not fully have a firm grasp on. But the text is used as the resource. These skills are not being taught in isolation independently on their own. They're being taught in reference to the text. Now let's talk about some specific learning activities that teachers can employ when they're using the content-based instruction method. The first one is dictogloss. So dictogloss would be where a student listens to a talk or listens to the text read aloud twice. The first time when the student's listening to it, they're focusing on just getting a general grasp or a general overview of the text and its meaning, so the main idea. The second time the student listens, they're trying to pick out the specific details of the passage. And the idea is that later students will write down what they found, and based on that and through discussions, students have an understanding of how texts are organized. So normally texts are organized, especially nonfiction texts, with a topic sentence that tells you what the paragraph is going to be about. And then the following sentence after the topic sentence are specific detail sentences that provide evidence for the topic sentence or provide support for why the topic sentence is correct. Another popular instructional activity in the content-based instruction method are using graphic organizers. So when teachers use graphic organizers, they're visuals that often contain symbols and often have opportunities for students to write down in their own words what they've learned and how they are thinking. And these graphic organizers demonstrate how students think. And it also can demonstrate how information is organized. A third activity in the content-based instruction method is the language experience approach. And this is where students would tell their teacher a personal story about their life, and then students would write down that story. Then students would read their story to their teacher, and if needed, the teacher would provide them support in reading their story. And this is another whole language method because it's emphasizing the meaning of the text. In this case, it's a text that the students created themselves. A fourth activity is called process writing. In process writing, it focuses on the many steps of the writing process, and students will brainstorm together about possible ideas they might want to write about, and then they'll write several drafts, and after each draft it'll be revised. Often it's revised by both the teacher and fellow students. And then students revise their writing to ensure that it is clear for the reader to understand. So they realize that their writing has a purpose, and it's to convey a meaning and to relay a message. But in order for it to be effective, it has to be comprehensible to the reader. A fifth activity that could be very effective in content-based instruction lessons are dialogue journals. So dialogue journals, if you've seen the movie Freedom Writers, then you might have seen dialogue journals in action. But basically, dialogue journals are a two-way conversation between the student and the teacher, and it's through journal writing. So students will regularly write in their journals and about a particular topic or how they feel, and then the teacher will respond to students' writing, but the teacher does not correct or edit the writing per se for spelling or grammar or punctuation. It's rather just to understand the meaning of the writing and to have a dialogue between teachers and students so that students can practice language for a particular purpose. Let's review the learning goals of content-based instruction. The first goal is that students should learn grade-level academic content and language structures simultaneously. So they're learning what they need to learn in those content classes like math, science, and social studies, but at the same time they're learning the necessary language so they can effectively communicate with their peers and their teacher and to demonstrate their understanding. Second, students further develop relevant grade-level appropriate vocabulary, and it's academic vocabulary. So students are going beyond just the informal, everyday vocabulary that they might use with their friends and their family, but they're developing the important academic vocabulary that will allow them to comprehend in the content areas. A third goal is that students will understand how academic texts are organized, specifically nonfiction texts. So nonfiction texts begin with a first sentence, which is like a topic sentence, which often expresses the main idea of that paragraph. And then the following sentences provide evidence or support for that topic sentence. And so through the content-based instruction method, students are regularly engaged in analyzing content texts, especially nonfiction texts. And so they get a better grasp of how information is organized so that they can develop the main idea even if they do not understand every specific individual detail in the text. If they can develop an understanding of the main idea with the topic sentence, that's a great benefit to them. So the role of the teacher in the content-based instruction method is to identify and explain to students what are the essential content objectives and language objectives. They need to address that in the beginning of the lesson to call attention to students of what they should be learning in the class. They need to provide relevant content objectives that are appropriate for the grade level. So just because students are learning a second language or they are English language learners, they still need to be exposed to the relevant and grade appropriate content objectives. So what everyone else is learning in their science, math, reading, and social studies classes. Once again, we talked about language objectives. That's the language that students will need to have to be successful to learn that content. And so language objectives are, of course, emphasized and are pre-taught and relatively referenced and scaffolded so that students can have an understanding of that content area and that language is not a barrier. So the view of culture under the content-based instruction method is that culture should be relevant to each individual content subject. So there's a unique culture of scientists or science, there's a unique culture of mathematicians or math, etc., and that students should have access to that culture by knowing the academic vocabulary of that discipline. So some of the domains of language that are emphasized is that language skills are emphasized, but it really depends on what is the content area or the topic. So there could be one day where they're emphasizing the past tense when they're talking about history, or in another day they might be talking about the present tense and even the conditional tense. If this happens, this would happen in science, for example, cause and effect kind of things in an experiment. All four skills, all four domains of language are emphasized. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing are all emphasized. They're just emphasized at different times. Normally, though, because of the nature of a lesson and how it's presented by the teacher, obviously students' skills of listening and reading will be immediately addressed. And then also, if they're answering questions, their speaking will also be involved. Writing will often come last, but still all four domains are being engaged in the content-based instruction method. And then once again, like we've said before, academic vocabulary is regularly taught, basically daily. And it's pre-taught. So if students are given information and are exposed to this new vocabulary and they are taught that vocabulary in the context, so that when they see it in the lesson that they're not shocked by it or confused or kind of zoning out because they've never heard of that vocabulary term before. Instead, they're exposed to it before they even get into the content lesson, and that way they already have some pre-existing knowledge that they can connect to the academic vocabulary and the content of that lesson. For evaluation, teachers' response to errors, students are evaluated based on their knowledge of the content area, but also they can be evaluated by their ability to use the language and the ability to exemplify the language objective. So when students are demonstrating their knowledge through writing or through reading comprehension texts or even writing short answers, all of these times they're incorporating both their content knowledge that they've learned in that subject, but they're also having to use it using language skills that they've developed in that lesson. They'll be evaluated similarly to how all students are evaluated in terms of their content knowledge. And so the idea, once again, is you don't water down the content objectives, you don't water down the TEKS, you teach the TEKS that are the same TEKS, but you provide additional scaffolds for your English language learners so that those TEKS are accessible. Teachers can respond to errors by doing one of the following. They can either directly give the correct answer to the students, they can allow students to self-correct, or they could just note the error and reteach the concept later, or repeat the concept, or have regular opportunities to practice so that students eventually master the concept and can self-correct on their own. Now let's move on to task-based language teaching. Once again, there's a wonderful video, probably one of the best videos that I've seen for this section of our book that I found on YouTube, and so there's a link for that, for task-based language teaching. So let's give a brief overview and discussion of the language use and learning activities of task-based learning. So task-based learning is similar to the communicative language teaching method in that students are asked to complete real-world tasks. They're trying to accomplish something that is relevant to what they would see in their daily lives. The difference is that task-based learning does not focus on just one language objective. It often will incorporate many different language objectives into one lesson. And then also the target language is only used in the task-based learning teaching method. So the tasks or activities that students participate in all have a clear purpose and outcome. They also have a real-world relevance to students' lives outside the classroom. Normally, the teacher will demonstrate the task at hand by providing a pre-task or a model activity, and students will later often do that model activity with their peers. And then after they've mastered the pre-task, or they've understood at least what's going to be asked in the lesson, and they've been introduced in the through the pre-task to the important language and task objectives, then students go off on their own to complete the task. And the good benefit of these tasks is that they have clear objectives and clear results, so both students and teachers can tell when the task has been completed effectively. Its emphasis on language is that language's purpose should be for communicating and also for doing, to helping people solve real-world problems and solve real-world tasks. Students learn their language indirectly by being engaged in the relevant tasks and by working collaboratively with peers to solve those real-world tasks. So they are practicing their language while completing these tasks. And so it's kind of like language flows hand in hand with the completion of this real-world objective. And so another option for task-based learning could be project work, or sometimes people call it project-based learning. And so normally project-based learning or project work follows 3 steps. So first you have the planning step, where students collaborate with their peers and teacher to identify what will be the scope of their project, and the teacher and the students determine what are going to be the roles and duties of each student. Second, students engage in a research and collect information about how to best complete the project. And this could be both inside and outside the classroom. Later, the third step, students complete the project, work together collaboratively with their peers, fulfill all their roles that they've assigned, and then after they complete the project, they receive feedback from their fellow peers and from their teacher. So the role of the teacher under task-based learning is that the teacher will select the tasks that are relevant to students' needs. So the teacher will identify what she or he thinks is most important for the grade level or for the age of those students, based on their current language levels and based on their daily lives, what comes up as an issue in their daily lives. Once again, the teacher pre-teaches the task to model the activity and also to model the language use. Then the teacher can provide follow-up tasks based on how students performed on the lesson. So if students see that if the teacher sees that students are making some common errors in one aspect of the task, then the teacher might just emphasize that one aspect of the task the next time. Or maybe if the teacher sees that the students have mastered it and the task is kind of easy for them, then the teacher knows that she or he will make a harder task with more complex language objectives for the next task. Furthermore, the teacher doesn't actively interact necessarily with the students after the teacher has done the initial modeling of the activity. So first, the teacher initially models the activity, and then the teacher more or less observes what the students are doing and how they're interacting with peers. They provide some guidance and correction only if it's necessary, only if students are really having difficulty completing the task. They don't just interrupt for every small language error. The teacher will note that language error and then come back later to correct it as a whole group or individually with the student. Task-based learning does not directly address culture, but if you think about it, many tasks can have cultural elements. So it really is based on the task that the teacher assigns. If the teacher assigns an how-to paper where students write a how-to paper with steps and a process paper where they make an ethnic dish of their choice, then that, of course, would involve some cultural elements. Or if students have to research a society in which they are learning that society's target language, then that would be another aspect where they would learn the culture of that society along with the language skills. In task-based learning teaching, the type of language or domains of language that are emphasized are the importance of understanding and comprehending spoken and written language. So the importance of being able to comprehend what is being spoken to you and you are reading. So basically listening and reading comprehension. Another aspect of language that is important is the production of making comprehensible communication for others to demonstrate your knowledge and to demonstrate your message. And so this would be when students are speaking to each other in their peer collaboration, and also when they're presenting their projects to their teacher and to their peers. Or also if they were writing down and providing a written excerpt of what they've understood or what they've learned from the experience, or any kind of written text that they provide along with solving the task. That would be a case where they're also demonstrating the importance of people being able to understand their written language. Once again, tasks can address any of the 4 language domains, and they're not always specific to just one. They could address 2 at the same time, or 3, or all of them. The teacher begins to evaluate students informally as they're observing students complete the task with their peers. Later, teachers formally evaluate students based on the student's end product of their task outcome. And also the teacher can evaluate students based on the type of language students use when they're presenting their product to the class. Teachers normally redress errors not individually but as a collective, so they observe where many students are making the same error and they provide additional follow-up tasks or additional modeling or even a brief grammar lesson to explain and correct those errors. And then the teacher will provide further practice opportunities so students can self-correct. Now let's move on to Chapter 12, the political dimensions of language teaching and the participatory approach. There's 2 nice videos you can see that explain the participatory approach, which is the main method we're going to learn in this chapter. And so you can look at those on your own time. But first, I want to discuss a little bit about the political dimensions of language teaching. This is how Larsen-Freeman introduced the chapter, and this sets the background for the participatory method and the need for that method in many classrooms. So Larsen Freeman describe how language gives a person a power. The ability to speak and comprehend language allows someone to participate fully in their community, and so therefore it gives them power. Some worry that because of the spread of English internationally, so English has now become kind of like a lingua franca, where most speakers at least speak English as a second language across the world. Some worry that this could threaten endangered languages or minority languages that are not as commonly spoken. There are people who are worried that instead of transmitting the native language to future generations, parents might focus on providing their children with opportunities to learn English, since English will provide their children with more economic and social opportunities, since it's more of a global language. Political dimensions of language teaching also imply a conception of critical pedagogy. So critical pedagogy means that as a teacher, you're inspiring and ensuring that your students develop an awareness of social injustice. And not only are they aware of what's unjust or what's unfair and unethical in the world, but students are empowered and given resources to be able to promote a more egalitarian society. And the teacher provides them not only with resources, but also provides them with encouragement as students work to make society more fair and just for all. Another aspect of the political dimensions of language teaching is that teachers themselves have to consider what is their role, and what kind of dialogue are they presenting in their classrooms. It's very important that teachers choose texts that represent all groups, that value all cultures, and this would be especially important when students are learning English as a second language, because the goal is not to displace students' native culture or native language, but with the new culture of the United States or with English. Instead, the goal is to have an additive context, kind of like what you learn in your language development classes. So an additive context would be where students maintain their native language and their native culture, but they also develop fluency in their second language, their target language, and they develop cultural appreciation and cultural competency in their second target language as well, which in our case in the United States would most likely be English for many of our students. Also, furthermore, there's discussion in Larsen-Freeman's book about what role should non-native speakers play if they choose to be teachers of English. For example, some countries prioritize choosing people who are native speakers of English to teach English to children or to people in that country. For example, I know the countries of Korea and Japan emphasize and especially promote American college graduates to come to those countries to be teachers, and they are supposed to be the native speakers who are the examples to the students of correct pronunciation and correct language use. However, Larsen-Freeman make an interesting point that if you only emphasize native speakers as teachers of a language, then what about the aspect of people who were non-native speakers but developed fluency in that language, and they could be a sense of pride and a role model for many of these students who are learning this language similar to their teacher as a second language. So students can see, hey, my teacher looks like me and had the same experiences as me, and now through hard work and through practice and through continued educational pursuits, that teacher is now a fluent speaker. So it's very important to think not necessarily about whether a teacher is a native speaker or not, but actually whether that teacher has the training qualifications to be the effective teacher. Many times, actually, non-native speakers who have spent many years learning that language have a firm grasp of the grammar and the syntax and the language structure of the language, sometimes even more than a native speaker. So what they lack in pronunciation, a non-native speaker might might make up for that lack of pronunciation with increased knowledge of grammar skills and language structure. Now let's get into the participatory approach. Let's provide a quick overview. So the participatory approach focuses on having a lesson that is based on the language needs of students' particular needs in their daily lives, or what problems they face in their daily lives. So the goal is to provide students with the language that they will need to overcome any difficulties they face, or to meet the ends that they are trying to pursue in their lives, in their careers, or in their family lives. So the curriculum is not predetermined. It's basically based on what students specifically want to learn or discuss. And that increases the relevance of the instructional content to the students. They are more engaged because this is exactly what they need to learn to be successful in their lives. And they had more choice in the topics and activities of the classroom because they chose what language and what topics to discuss. They've done studies that have shown that the more choices students have, the more engaged they are in the lesson, and the more relevant they find the lesson. So let's talk about some of the language use and learning activities with the participatory approach. So once again, instruction is normally in the target language, but there is an emphasis that students' native language should not be lost. And so there's never a direct rule where you cannot speak in your native language, or you cannot use your native language with a partner to help explain your point of view or to communicate more clearly. Still, the goal was to learn the target language so that students can be politically active and be active in their communities that are using the target language, the majority language of that country. So the teacher begins the lesson by asking students what they want to learn or what is going on in their daily lives. And then the students and the teacher have a discussion about those issues. And then they kind of problem solve together as a group what they could do, or they make suggestions about how they could learn more about the subject or what they would need to solve the problem. Then the teacher might go into one specific scenario in detail, and that topic could be from something students expressed the day before and earlier lessons, or it could even be that specific day. And the teacher will help go into further detail and provide students with the language skills they need to successfully solve that problem. So once again, the teacher will give students the skills to understand the problem in the target language, to discuss and communicate the issue in the target language, and address the problem, like fix the problem in their daily lives when they're using that target language in the majority culture or the majority language, the target language. So in the United States, it would be English. As part of the class, students collaborate with each other and the teacher, and they use appropriate language to address the problem, and they refine that language so that they can effectively communicate to government officials or to community stakeholders or employment officials effectively. As we mentioned before, the learning goals of the participatory approach is that students will understand the language that is necessary for their daily lives, and they'll be able to use that language to communicate effectively with community stakeholders. So that could be local community leaders, that could be government officials, that could be employment members of their profession, what have you. Students also work with their peers and with their teacher for the goal of developing a voice in the new language, which enables them to be active in their society and to take action on particular issues that are relevant to them. Students also create and co-construct texts together, so they'll write texts or writings together, and this will be a way for them to facilitate their language learning and to practice their new language skills that they've developed in that lesson. So students are often asked to do such things as write a letter to the mayor expressing your concern about a topic in your community, or advocate to a local publication about the need for something, or summarize and describe your culture and your values of your community to other people who may not be aware of them. All of these involve written texts that students create and that teachers help edit to ensure that students are effectively communicating and using their power through language to make effective change in the way they want. So some other learning goals is that students will develop increased political consciousness, so understand issues that are going on in their society and be more aware and more active and participatory in government and in local community action. Students will be able to utilize language when needed to solve political problems that affect their daily lives. So it could be problems in their work, or problems in their neighborhood, or problems in their students' schools, or problems as a whole and throughout the community. And then students, since they are now able to communicate effectively in that language, especially in the context of these issues, students have more political power and have more political say. The role of the teacher in the participatory approach is that the teacher is a co-learner with the students. By co-learner, the teacher is learning what the students need and learning from the students' personal experiences and beliefs. And the teacher learns about these personal experiences and beliefs of the students through asking questions at the beginning of each lesson. So both the teacher and the student are learners. The students learn the language skills from the teacher, and the teacher learns from the experiences of the students. Furthermore, teachers and students participate in regular dialogues about problems in their lives, and the teacher tries to help in any way possible to provide solutions or provide resources for students to solve these problems. Furthermore, teachers use those topics, those issues, as lesson content and help provide language connections and language resources for students to solve those problems. The view of culture in the participatory approach is that language is essential for providing political power for individuals and for allowing people to equally participate in their communities. And so it's a culture of egalitarianism, of equality. Culture is emphasized as it's related to the cultural experiences and daily experiences of students. So the culture of their students themselves, their home culture from their homelands, but also the culture that they experience in their daily lives now that they experience in their new country as English language learners is also emphasized. The domains of language emphasized in the participatory approach are first the domain of communication abilities, so listening, speaking, and writing. Those are the initial domains, especially listening and speaking, because that's how the students refine their voice and their political voice to express their opinion. Later, grammar and form, language form, and language accuracy are later stressed, and the teacher helps correct and provide feedback to students, especially in their written messages, their texts that they write to present to community officials. And the idea is that community officials will be better persuaded if they are presented with written text or written essays, written letters that are grammatically correct. Literacy, although it's not the initial skill emphasized, is later emphasized heavily in this method because literacy is especially important in keeping people informed of their community and what's going on. And so students need to be able to read newspapers and to be able to read academic texts and read articles on the internet to learn more about their community and to be to have those resources to effectively lobby for their community and for their families. Once again, all language skills are taught through the participatory approach. For evaluation, the teacher's response to errors in the participatory approach. So as we've talked about, a lot of the process is student-directed and student-centered. So students evaluate their own learning as they're going through the process. If they feel like they're not being effective in communicating, they ask the teacher for help to refine their message, or they help their they ask their fellow classmates for help. Students are regularly encouraged to self-evaluate and to consider in which areas is the learning especially relevant to their lives. And if it's not as relevant, the topic of discussion shifts to make it more relevant to their lives. Students are encouraged to self-correct. The teacher can identify student errors and will provide feedback, especially on students' written communication. But students are also regularly encouraged to self-correct and to correct in a positive manner, constructively, their partners and their colleagues in the classroom, their fellow peers. Furthermore, based on how teachers point out there are certain errors or when their peers point out errors, students then go back, use that feedback, and correct those errors. So a lot of it is like a learning process where students are the ones that are realizing that they're making the error and then they're correcting it themselves based on the skills that their teacher and their peers provide for them. As you can see, just to sum up, the participatory approach is often a type of method used in classrooms that are high school ESL classrooms or adult ESL classrooms, just by the political nature of the method and the importance of it. So a lot of it is you need people who are politically active or politically motivated and also have real world issues or real world obligations that they are trying to meet. And so this type of approach is probably best used in the high school classroom or in the adult ESL classroom. Those students will be particularly responsive to this method and will have the most to gain from becoming politically active and becoming politically effective in representing their opinions. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week.